Författare från Kanada.
Japp. Han är en av de online-människor som jag litar mest på. Otroligt kunnig. Har böcker om Rwanda och jag tror det var en annan om USAs krigsföring i Sydamerika, specifikt mot Venezuela, tror jag. En fantastisk anti-imperialist. Också håller Anti-Empire Project. Har haft så kallade situation reports, det vill säga korta, ibland längre också, men under folkmordet har han kört situation report, så kallad podcasts kanske, eller liksom videorapporter, där han sammanfattade ganska mycket av vad som pågår på liksom slagfältet i Gaza. Men också mycket djupanalys. Han är en underbar, otroligt kunnig människa. Medan allt detta pågick så hade han sin historiepodcast om första världskriget. Han hade en annan serie om Scramble for Africa också. Så han kan väldigt mycket och är en väldigt principfast människa.
Han ser väldigt intellektuell ut om att vara sån.
Alltså det är han. Och det vi gjorde, vår föreläsning med honom om 7 oktober, då var det med John Elmer också. Och John Elmer är från Electronic Intifada. Han brukade vara med också på Justins sitreps då och då också. Och Justin fortsätter med sina sitreps, men det är lite mindre oftare nu, så det är typ varje vecka istället för, det var typ, ibland var det typ 3 gånger om veckan beroende på vad som pågick då. Han spenderade väldigt mycket tid åt det här faktiskt.
Och idag ska vi prata om the myth of nonviolence.
Precis. När vi försökte sätta namn på vår projekt här, när ni kom med idén Fredshetsarna, så tänkte jag att det är en väldigt, väldigt fint namn. Men jag tänker ändå att man bör definiera vad man menar med fred. Vilken slags fred. För väldigt många, särskilt
peace
som
through strength, eller vad är det de säger?
Ja, det är något att prata om kanske. Men snarare också att folk pratar väldigt mycket om pacifism, eller liksom, nonviolence, och Ghandi var underbar, och varför har inte palestinier en Ghandi och så vidare, alla sådana frågor. Och själva nonviolence har gjorts till en, slagträ mot alla möjliga antikoloniala rörelser. Och på något sätt pacifierat folk också. Och jag har lärt mig en hel del från Justin just om det också. Och han har skrivit flera artiklar om det. Och det är typ det jag vill börja prata om i alla fall. Och sen efter det kan vi gå in till andra saker, mer aktuella saker kanske.
Men det tycker jag är jätteintressant. Jag vill också gärna ha mer kött på benen. För jag minns när vi hade vad heter han, söndagsintervjun, Martin Wiklin här. Och vi pratade om Hamas kom upp, och då sa han men måste väl ändå vara överens om att det är en terrorgrupp, och så det kan man ju tycka, men det är inte bara det. Och så sa jag typ så här, men kan säga något kolonialt förtryck som har avslutats helt utan våld. Och då sa han just Ghandi, och då var jag så här, det här kan ju inte vara sant, men jag har fan inte läst på om det här. Så jag kunde liksom
det kommer du få lära dig om idag, tror jag. För det är ett stort exempel han sågar igenom. Och han, om jag inte har fel, så har han indisk påbrå också. Så det är nog, han kan just den frågan också, historien, det vill säga.
Men jag tycker också att det är så spännande med så här intellektuella personer som man ändå har respekt för. Vi hade Göran Rosenberg och Åsa Linderborg här och pratade om Göran Rosenbergs resa, och då säger Åsa så här: Men vad tycker du, vad ska palestinierna göra då? För jag tror ju inte att vapen kommer lösa någonting. Och han bara, nej det tror inte jag heller. Jag bara...
Alltså man kan, alltså just på det, alltså just om Palestina, det är så tydligt med Great March of Return 2018. Att man fortfarande pratar om men varför palestinier gör inte nonviolence, eller liksom varför har de inte använt Ghandi-liknande metoder och så vidare. De har försökt. Och då sköt israeler, alltså de mördade nära 300 människor och 30 000 blev skadade. Och väldigt många av dem permanent skadade. Alltså de tävlade, israeliska snipers då tävlade med att räkna antal kneecaps
just det.
Lyckades skjuta. Alltså det är en permanent skada. De har ju mördat paramedics och dylikt där också. Så den där, varför palestinier gör inte nonviolence, det har de försökt.
Ja.
Och det resulterade med, och dessutom det hände ingenting som resultat.
Exakt.
Alltså internationella media eller organisationer, ingen sa någonting om det. Det var bara, okej, ja.
Och man vet att så här, man skulle ju aldrig ens komma på tanken på att säga så om Ukrainas rätt till...
Ja, varför? Ja, precis.
Jag tror inte Ukraina borde använda vapen. Det är inte en lösning.
Ja, varför är det en lösning för Ukraina men inte för...
De skulle aldrig komma på tanken på att säga en sån sak.
Precis.
Det är väldigt intressant.
Jag vet inte. Jag skickade möteslänken till honom som e-mail också.
Har du sett något annat som har förargat dig? Eller det kan också vara good news. Det finns också good news. Jag såg en glad ekorre på Instagram.
Ja. Om man tänker good news, jag vet inte. Det är svårt. Men att jag ser mer och mer att folk agerar och tröttar på det. Det är liksom, jag ser i alla fall i sociala medier, ser jag att folk reagerar ändå.
Ja, det är så.
Och det tycker jag är positivt faktiskt. Det här med Lorena Delgado Varas, allt det där.
Just det.
Och allt det där. Alltså det är bara, det är riktigt deppigt att folk fortfarande försöker tolka det som om att det var antisemitism. Som jag skrev något om det idag, att från och med nu kommer jag inte debattera antisemitismfrågan. Jag vill liksom inte. Jag kan lyfta hur dåligt det var någon annan liksom, som ett exempel. Men om folk vill prata om antisemitism kan de göra i en annan sammanhang som har inget att göra med Palestinafrågan. Det har ingenting att göra med det. Förutom då att påpeka det används som ett vapen mot Palestina-solidariteten och som en sköld för Israel. Förutom det, om man inte pratar om det på det sättet, så har jag ingen intresse i att prata om det tillsammans med Palestina-frågan.
Nej, det är väl rimligt. Hur menar du? Hur kan jag göra mer? Det kommer alltid vara den där ramen uppe till, eller? Okay.
Justin är redo förresten när vi är redo.
Ja, men vi kör.
Gött.
Tacksamheten. Får se vad som händer nu då med bilden, om jag måste... Ja, just det. Så där blir det, precis.
Och som sagt, vi har en 90 minuters gräns från Justin.
Det tror jag att min hjärna har en lite kortare. Borde inte han ha på fiket? Han är fan från Ramallah. Han borde inte ha Coca-Cola. Eller? Josef på fiket, han borde inte ha sälja Coca-Cola. Om vi är en apartheid-free zone borde han vara. Ja, vi har ju sån klistermärke bara, for your information. Palestine Coke.
Gör det.
Men faktiskt. Han hade ändå koll på när vi visade så här Omar Bugatti eller han BDS BSI.
Barghouti, ja.
Ja, den familjen, de är jävligt smarta. Ja. Avtal. Bryt alla avtal. Inga avtal gäller. Jag har mejlat dem och bett om influencersamarbete. Jag har inte fått svar tyvärr. Men de lär ju drunkna i många mejl ändå. Det tror jag. Jag hoppas. Ja, precis. Ser du Palestine Coke på sociala medier något?
Ibland, ja.
Borde vara överallt hela tiden.
Ja, jag ser det där jag brukar alltså inte handla, men det finns ett pizzeria som jag brukar handla från. Så de har det. Ja, det blir vanligare och vanligare tror jag. Men den dagen jag kommer se det på Coop kommer jag vara väldigt glad.
Det är det som behövs. Ja. Liksom. Matjättarna.
Ja, det känns väldigt svårt. Podur kanske väntar på 4:00. Men jag har sagt till honom att han är välkommen över. Så.
Ja, det sprakade i proppskåpet här idag så vi blev lite oroliga och det tog typ lite gnistor så vi bara stäng ner allt, ring elektriker. Men hade någon tillfällig lösning så nu är det... allt funkar, man ska byta någon skit. Jag har aldrig varit med om att det slår gnistor om ett proppskåp. Då känner man ändå det här kan bli problematiskt.
Men skönt att det gick bra. Har du sett något intressant i veckan?
Nej, jag har varit så jävla avskärmad. Där. Hallå.
Yeah.
Hi,
how are you?
Hello.
I got to change my name. I realized
Yes, please do.
I'm written as me.
I'm also me.
Hi, me. How are you?
Me. My name is Frederick. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Frederick. I don't know the system, so I have to figure out how to change me.
If I can...
Maybe you can change me.
I'm gonna just see if I can do that. No, I can't.
Okay.
Men det kan
Should I go out and come back, or is
you can do that. You can do that. Maybe that's best.
It works for us, but if
personal data. Oh.
If you can't figure it out easily, just reconnect. That's fine.
There, I got it.
Awesome, fantastic,
cool. Alrighty.
Welcome. Second time we're talking. On camera.
That's right. I feels like we're old friends now.
Well, I mean, I definitely feel so, but that's great to hear from you.
you have definitely dumped more friends, so it's good to have a few new ones.
Yeah.
I mean, parasocially, you're my best older brother.
Okay.
It would be interesting just to hear Justin's thoughts on our name of the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. The reason, I thought about you directly when they told me about the name suggestion for our podcast, which means peacemongers in English.
Oh yeah, I like it.
But I was like, okay, but what kind of peace? Are we talking about pacifist?
Yeah.
Are we talking about nonviolence? And then I thought directly about your article and.
Yeah, but I still think peace. I mean, in the 70s, the anti-war movement was, they basically said the anti-war. The right wing said if you're anti-war, you're basically a communist, right? So there's always been an association of peace with anti-imperialist, because in the long run, constant wars are not in our interest, I would say.
Yeah, so maybe we can dive into the topic itself. So the idea is that we will talk about, sort of half of the time we will talk about nonviolence.
Sure.
And how it's sort of ironically weaponized, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we can maybe talk more about the actual, or the, what do you call it, more today's stuff, because a lot of things are happening, as you know.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, of course.
So if you want to, I mean, we have already introduced you before you joined. So if you want to say something about yourself, you're free to, of course, do that as well. But otherwise, you can.
Yeah. So I guess so it's called the Anti-Empire Project. The YouTube channel is the Anti-Empire Project, where I do now weekly. It used to be 3 or 4 times a week, but updates on the military situation in the war on Gaza primarily, but everything around with Yemen and Iran now, and everywhere that's part of this war. And then I also have a historical podcast of the same name, and we do current events sometimes, but the audio side, we have been focused mainly on history. And we started in 1500 or 1492 or whatever, and then we've now reached, and that was in 2020. So 5 years later, we've gotten past World War I, and we're currently studying the Treaty of Versailles. So it's interesting how no matter what period or part of history we're studying on that show, there's always some kind of parallel in the way that they imposed the terms of the peace in Versailles in a way that in 1919, after World War I, in a way that was setting up, basically made the World War II inevitable, for one thing. Another thing was they had revolutionary Russia, and they were trying to figure out how to destroy the revolution in Russia without it contaminating the West. So they were constantly worried about Bolshevism coming to the West. So there are a lot of, your mind will always go to the parallels with what's going on today. So I think those are the two things that, I guess this is where I'm coming from a study of history over many, many years now for this podcast that you guys can check out, and also a study of this war, a fairly intense study of this war since 2023, from a kind of guerrilla warfare perspective, informed by those theories. So that's where I'm coming from here, for people who don't know.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was a good plug, correct plug. And I mean, as I said, the SITREPs especially have been incredibly valuable for, I mean, and I know from not just the people around me, but also the online solidarity movement, it meant a lot. It still does. So people definitely should check it out if they haven't, and go back in the catalog to see the deeper dives as well. For, I don't know, if you wonder, okay, how did the Gaza siege, how was it established, what happened then, and things like that. There are specific episodes, sometimes with John Elmer, sometimes with Nora Barrows-Friedman, and some other people as well. So there's absolutely fantastic information there. So just go check it out. Nonviolence. What should we understand?
Okay, so super important issue, because
no, sorry, that was completely me. Sorry, I just messed up. Go on.
Oh, okay, you muted yourself. So whenever anybody is in the West is mobilizing, whenever there's a mobilization against war, right now the Palestine movement, but it was very notable to me during the George Floyd kind of uprising after the murder of George Floyd by police, that the elite, from the top level of the politicians and the media to, and right into the mainstream organizations that organize these big demonstrations, they always say, keep it peaceful. That's one of the slogans. Keep it peaceful. Let's keep it peaceful. Let's keep it nonviolent. And the idea is that, and there's a lot of different directions from which to study this. And there's a historical one, and there's a theoretical one, and there's a security-based one. There's a lot of different angles. But let's just, the idea of the elite is telling the protesters, keep it peaceful. And organizations say, let's keep it peaceful. And there's a theory behind this that historically in parts of the world, and there's always two parts of the world that we always go to. One is India and one is the United States in the 1960s. That it's proven, there is a proven paradigm for nonviolent protest that can make exactly the change that the protesters want. And that proven paradigm for nonviolent protest is proven by these two cases. And what the first thing to look at, before we look at the more theoretical base or the security kinds of issues, just to look at the historical part that I'm approaching this from, those two cases are not cases of nonviolent success. So from a historical perspective, before we say anything else, it is a rewriting of history that you have to do to show, to argue that the Indian independence, that India became independent through nonviolent struggle. So the Indian struggle for independence had Gandhi, Gandhi was one of the most visible leaders, but Gandhi was not, it is also a rewriting of history to make Gandhi the only face of the movement. So if you go back to when Gandhi went to India before World War I started, he was in South Africa, and then at some point he went to India. And there was already a movement in India, and it was not, nonviolence was not whatsoever on the map. They were called them, there was armed groups. One of them was called the Hindu Republican Army. So they fashioned themselves after the Irish Republican Army, and they understood the IRA as having the right idea in terms of fighting the British. They knew how to fight the British. They got whatever weapons they could, and they did whatever armed action they could, and they fought battles with police, and their leaders were killed, and they sometimes shot and killed British officials. And the whole time when Gandhi was operating, there were also armed revolutionaries that were operating. And they actually had, in the historical record, there's lots of interface between not necessarily Gandhi himself, but people in the Indian National Congress, even the Nehru family, Motilal Nehru and Jawaharlal Nehru, both had certain kind of somewhat friendly relations with the Indian armed revolutionaries. And they quite consciously used that to negotiate with the British. And they said, look, you can deal with us or you're going to get this. And the British were also trying to say there's no difference between these Congress people and the terrorists. And that was the word the British used, because these Congress nonviolent revolutionaries know and talk to and have fund, in some cases, the terrorists, which they did. So that was always part of the revolution. And there are names like Chandrasekhar Azad, who died in a shootout with British police in a park in 1931. Bhagat Singh, lots of people have heard of Bhagat Singh, who was a communist, who was a revolutionary, and who died very young, and he was hanged by the British. And there were plenty more. Then we can go to World War II era, when there was one of the leaders from Congress named Subhash Chandra Bose. And Subhash Chandra Bose is often mentioned as like some kind of proto-Nazi because he worked with the Japanese in particular. And from a this is always a hard one to navigate. It's funny one to navigate now because the West is more and more openly Nazi as well. But they smear, or they make a lot out of Bose's connection to the Japanese, because there were, when the Japanese and the British fought in Asia, the British used Indian troops, as they did all over the world, including going back to World War I. A huge source of British power had always been, in the colonial era, the Indian troops, the Indian economy. So they used Indian troops, and in some battles, the Japanese captured some fairly large numbers of Indian troops. And Bose negotiated to create an Indian national army out of these captured Indian troops. And the Japanese were happy to do it, obviously, because they were trying to fight the British in Asia. And the Japanese were totally appalling, in some ways worse than the Nazis in China. But this is an imperial world where the colonized people, they don't, an Indian person can't tell the difference between a British and a German Nazi, right? They're not going to be able to make that distinction. It's the same debate over the Mufti of Jerusalem and how he went to Berlin and worked with the Germans. It's like that taboo around the Nazis also doesn't seem to exist anymore, and it didn't exist in the 30s. The British, Churchill admired Hitler. So it's also a.
That is all new to our audience, news to our audience, most of it. So it's okay if you want to sort of
dumb it down a little bit. It's
yes, hammer that in. It's all right.
So right. So a lot of we can I'll make a little diversion there. So during World War II, before, in the run up to World War II, the Soviet Union tried to get agreements with the Western powers, the British and the French, to get a security framework to basically say, look, Hitler is destructive. Hitler wants to destroy the Soviet Union. You guys don't like Hitler either. Why don't we make some kind of alliance? And so people go to this kind of timeline, because in 1930, I believe, 38, there was this agreement between Hitler and Stalin, or between Molotov and Ribbentrop, and it was called the Molotov-Ribbentrop. They had a non-aggression agreement, but the timeline that I guess the pro-communist people always say is like Stalin was trying to get an agreement to contain Hitler and fight Hitler throughout the 1930s, and the democracies, the French and the British, were like, no. Hitler's fine. It's the Bolsheviks that are the problem. So while they were all based, and of course America, a lot of American business, notably IBM and Ford, a lot of the big corporations were, absolutely funding the Nazis and working on Nazi projects like the punch cards that organized the population in order to facilitate sorting Jewish people from non-Jewish people in order to deport them and commit the Holocaust. That was like, I remember, like, there's a book called IBM and the Holocaust by Edwin Black that people should check out. I was dubious about this connection, but when you read the book, it's irrefutable. There, the names are named, the corporation, the time, they built custom machines for Nazi Germany to do this work. So America, Britain, France, all of these were perfectly fine with Hitler until the 40s, and they saw Hitler as a great counterbalance to Bolshevik Russia. So the taboo against people dealing with Hitler, especially third world movements or leaders dealing with Hitler or Japan, that was written afterwards. During decolonization, they said, the Mufti of Jerusalem collaborated with Hitler, and Netanyahu went so far as to say that the Holocaust was the Mufti's idea and not Hitler's idea. So the rewriting of history goes in many different ways, and that's one of them. So all of that discourse was to prepare you for the fact that Bose collaborated with the Japanese. He was trying to have an alliance with the Japanese to build an army to liberate India from the British. India was, remember, an outright colony. And the Indian National Army was not super successful militarily against the British. But when the war ended, the British wanted to hang the leaders of some certain leaders of the Indian National Army. And they wanted to hang them in 1946. And they planned to hang them, I believe they did hang them, at the Red Fort. So a very symbolic site in Delhi, in India. And the Indian Navy and a part of the Indian Army mutinied in 1946. And they took the position that these are patriots and we're not going to fight for you after you hang these patriots. And that was 1946, and there were riots, and the British, shot people down in the streets, and which they had done lots of times in 1919 and prior. But there was a riot, and the British got the distinct sense that the Indian Army was not going to fight for them. And Britain never had enough white people to control India. If Indian people didn't control India for them, they would not be able to control India. So that's 1946, and India becomes independent in 1947. So Gandhi had been agitating nonviolently since 1919. Quit India was in 1919. But the Indian Mutiny, the naval mutiny, was in 1946, and India got independence in 1947. So to me, that's a pretty strong piece of evidence that it was a violent revolt inside of the colonial military that led to India's independence, and not 3 decades of nonviolent agitation, which also, by the way, also had a lot of armed actions and a lot of, what we would call terrorism accompanying it as well. And if you look at a book, there's a recent book by P. Sainath called The Last Heroes. And he's an Indian journalist who went all around India to talk to old people before they die who actually participated in the struggle for independence. And the way they view Gandhi, they all view Gandhi with a lot of respect. Nobody has contempt for Gandhi. But they all view violence and nonviolence, smuggling pistols, beating up collaborators, feeding revolutionaries, going into a nonviolent march, boycotting British goods. Those are all together. Nobody that they talk to makes any sharp distinction between violence and nonviolence. So that's the Indian case. So the whole story that this was like Gandhi came, did nonviolent action, and forced the British to their knees is not true. And the history is very clear on that. I wrote one article with referring to all of these. It's on my Substack. And then there's another article on my Substack that I'll reference for the civil rights case, which is the American case. So this is Martin Luther King comes one day, marches, and the South gets free. So again, if you look at the history, and there are some very good, more recent books about this, where there's a book by someone who participated in kind of violent resistance in the South, and it's called Negroes with Guns. That's a short book. There's a book called The Deacons. There's a scholar who studied the Deacons for Defense. So some of these nonviolent marches, you guys, had armed Black people accompanying them. And there are numerous cases of there's nonviolent students. I might tear up telling the story, but there's a story of nonviolent students who were trying to desegregate a pool, and the cops came and the fire department came, and they were gonna spray them with this hose, and the hose is no joke, right? Getting sprayed with a hose is no joke if you're in like swimming pool gear, especially and you're a small kid. So these Deacons for Defense came, and they they had their guns out and they said, if you hose these kids down, there's going to be blood here. And they backed off. So it's like, this is a non-violent desegregation march, which is covered by armed men, who are like taking firing positions behind their cars.
I got some goosebumps.
So
actually.
It's like they're preventing violence.
Yeah,
the threat of violence.
They're keeping that's how you keep it non-violent, right? Otherwise, there's guaranteed to be violence. And there's these, you've all heard of the kids from the north who came to the south for specific desegregation actions, and they would sleep in houses of black people from the south, and they would tell these stories of how these black people would sit with their rifle on the porch all night awake so that the nonviolent kids could get a good night's rest before they did their nonviolent work in the morning. So that's the seamless nature of that struggle, which again is no different than any other struggle that's ever happened in history. So the point there is, like, there's never been a nonviolent struggle. There's never been a nonviolent struggle. The two cases that you always think of, Martin Luther King and Gandhi, those were long, violent, armed struggles where nonviolence was, some part of it, but it was never understood to be like, you can either do this violently or do this non-violent.
The sprinkle, the non-violent sprinkle.
You're muted, Fredrik.
I'm muted?
Sorry.
Am I muted?
Yeah,
Still muted.
Give me a sec.
Oh, well, maybe. Wasn't
Wasn't
that important?
I will do that for him. Where is it? Yes. Now I am asking you to unmute.
Doesn't matter.
Can you wait? No, we have to. We
invite you to unmute.
Still not working? I am asking you to unmute.
Are you asking me to
this
unmute?
program? So it's not working?
Can you hear me? No.
That's weird.
Raise your hand.
You can. But will you rejoin or? Yes, exactly.
Okay, weird.
Yeah, you're back.
Right.
Yeah.
It was nothing important. I just said there was just some non-violent sprinkle on the
it
armed
was
resistance.
a non-violent sprinkle. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't ever want to discount the importance of these sprinkles, because it takes everything. It takes every piece that you have should be used. Every tool that you have should be used. Right. So those two cases were not nonviolent.
There's also one that keeps popping up all the time. South Africa. Like people. Yeah. I mean, it's, if you know the history, it's obvious that it was like a mix. But people keep talking about Mandela as if he was a nonviolent.
No, never. That one's really strange, because there was an armed wing of the ANC. And they were constantly doing operations, and Mandela was in jail because he wouldn't renounce. Mandela's whole reason for being in jail, they were constantly negotiating with him and telling him if he would renounce violence, he could get out of jail. And he didn't get out of jail until after liberation, because he did not renounce violence. That was...
Why would it be on the terror list until 2008?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, okay. So those are the historical, and then there's another historical and theoretical bridge, which is Domenico Lacerdo. So Lacerdo wrote a fantastic book called Nonviolence: A History Beyond the Myth. I think that's what it's called. And he talks about Gandhi a little bit, and he also goes back as far as the abolitionists in the 19th century. And he kind of finds, he's very clever, because he finds some funny quotes where the same abolitionist will say, we have to be nonviolent. And then the slavery people, the slavers, start killing abolitionists. And then he says, we have to be nonviolent. The same guy, Garrison, I think it was. And he said, we have to be nonviolent towards people, but these slavers have proven that they're not people, they're not human, they're demonic, and so we have to do violence to them. So he sort of shows how people evolve, and And what he argues is basically like it's pretty easy to be nonviolent when it's not your life is not at stake. But as soon as your life is at stake, you start to have a different view. And he has numerous cases of this. Hannah Arendt is a really strong case of this, because he talks about how Hannah Arendt was constantly saying, you know, the Black people in the South need to be nonviolent. And she was constantly arguing that Black people in the South need to be nonviolent. But when you go back and look at her writings during World War II about the Nazis and the Jews, she's absolutely celebrates Jewish partisans. And she says something like, you know, Jewish people will remain, but maybe Germany won't anymore. And so she's happy to talk about the violent destruction of Germany in the context of World War II, but she would not want Black people to ever show any violence in the South, because her view of America was that it was already kind of perfect. And that's part of why that's part of what Lacerdo says. He says people are arguing for nonviolence because they're arguing ultimately to be incorporated into a system that they think is good but flawed. And when you're talking about a colonial war like Palestine, or all of the African wars of decolonization, or Asia, you know, in the context of decolonization, they're not trying to assimilate into that system. You can't assimilate into that system. It's a racial system. It's not for you. So there's no fighting that in a nonviolent way, because nonviolence is a logic of co-optation. And it's basically like, look, we're going to agitate according to these rules because we're all part of the same society. And, you know, that's also the assumption behind like voting. These are all kind of continua. There's a continuum between nonviolent action and voting. It's all kind of like pressure on people within a society that you identify with, and that in theory identifies with you. But if it's a racial thing where they don't see you as human and dehumanization is part of the logic, there's just no way that applies. And they want to tell people, the oppressed, to be nonviolent just because it makes oppressing them easier. It's just
this makes me think of I have a morning radio show, and we talked about this activist group who does like non-violent but still actions, like a
impel action, and going to factories and
this time they went to Vasa museum, this old ship that sunk many years ago, and our sidekick here, he was like, why can't they do nice things instead? That would be so much better. It's kind of the same framework of thoughts, you know. If they now, I just hate them, and I don't want to restore these lands that they're fighting for. What if they just did some nice things instead?
Yeah, sure. Then they shoot your kneecaps simply.
Yeah, there are a lot of best friends. I always call them like the activist's best friend. And there's a funny tweet about it where it's like, you know, in quotes it goes, "You're not helping your cause," and then the person, it's like, "Person who hates you and your cause." It's like it's a person who hates you and your cause that's giving you advice on how to best put you know, get your cause forward. So that's the posture, and the nonviolence is always like part of that posture. And in a way, it's a big part of counterinsurgency too, because you're trying to get the movement to do things to yourselves that the police then don't have to do to you, right? So if you have nonviolence cops in your, you know, self-appointed cops in your demonstration, they're going to identify people who do things that are violent. They're going to help, you know, they're going to exclude them and isolate them and make it easier for they're just, all of which is to like make life easier for the police. And from a security perspective, you know, the revolutionaries have always said, like, if you're in a struggle with a state that's ruthless, people are going to go to jail, people are going to be, you know, violently abused. And the Palestine movement has faced tons of that, right? Journalists have been arrested and had their devices seized, and people have been beaten and pepper sprayed and arrested and held, and there's all these deported in America. So all of these things are part, you know, if you take on a struggle that is just, that the powers that be have decided is illegal or terrorist, you can be violent, you can be nonviolent, you're going to get in big trouble with the law regardless. They can change the laws to whatever they want, and if, you know, and then you're going to get in trouble. But the security philosophy is not to make it easy for them. Don't just hand it to them. So like, leave your phone at home. Don't bring your phone to the demo and give it to the cops so they can piece your network together. Like, all of these things, you know, there's one black revolutionary, I think it was from the 70s, and they said, you know, we want the state to bear the cost of catching us. You know, we don't like it's expensive. Like, these are ultimately, you know, a struggle, a social struggle is a struggle of imposing costs on one another.
Yeah, it's like an attrition, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so if you give them things for free that they want, you're making their lives easier.
You're not helping the cause.
And you're not helping the cause. You're not helping your cause.
You're actively fighting your cause, actually.
Tell the police, you know, you guys are not helping your cause by arresting all these people.
Well, if we can, because so you have this series of articles about nonviolence. You talk about the Black Civil Rights Movement, and then India, and then you connect that aptly with Palestine, with the Great March of Return. Can we maybe talk about that a bit as well, so that people understand the sort of, because I mean, I knew about it, but I do keep forgetting the numbers. Like the 30,000 injured. Yeah. That's mind-blowing. I mean, of course, not now, but at the time, it was insane. So if we can maybe talk about that a bit.
Yeah, and again, like, just like this genocide, it took place, you know, before the cameras. I mean, it was a little bit less universal saturation of cameras, but it was 2018. People had cameras. All of this stuff there was tons of photographs and video of everything that happened. Everybody knew what happened. The snipers bragged about shooting people in the head and, you know, all of their shots. The Israeli snipers just picked their shots, and they just shot people and killed them. It was fun for them. It was like, you know, we know what, I mean, I don't know how well your listeners know, but like, people who have been following the genocide since 2023, they know what Israel has become. They know what Israeli society is like now. It's just sport for them. There's no human feeling. There's no human connection at all. It's just picking off, you know, people for sport. And there's a sadism and racism there. So that was 2018 was, you know, a young person got the idea to make the month of March 2018 the March of Return. So it wasn't like people think it was a march, but it was actually a march, like the month. But it went on much longer, and they marched to the fence that was fencing them in, and basically in large numbers they marched and camped, and the Israelis just, you know, shot them down. And there was a theory. It's interesting because George Orwell, who is wrong about everything and horrible and awful, and like it's totally weird that he's a racist imperialist. It's totally weird that he's like the paradigm for anti-imperialist writers, and that people still quote him because he said, you know, like, up is down and freedom is strength and war is peace, and people thought that was profound, but it's like, there's nothing profound. If you read, Isaac Asimov wrote a review of Orwell's book 1984. John Dolan from The War Nerd wrote a review of Homage to Catalonia. There's some great scathing material about Orwell, but Orwell wrote a theoretical piece, just as another example of how he's wrong, about nonviolence. And he basically said the reason Gandhi succeeded while you could not succeed as a nonviolent movement against the Nazis is because British allow a free press, and the Nazis didn't. And so every part of that is wrong, right? Gandhi didn't have a nonviolent movement. As I said, the movement for independence in India was violent. The British absolutely did not have a free press. They arrested and they smashed printing presses and arrested newspaper, people all the time and put them in jail. And it wasn't, whatever nonviolence was done in India was not successful. It was the armed struggle that was successful.
And I mean, how many millions have they killed? I mean, like,
yeah,
that's also something I got shocked when I read your article first, because I mean, okay, this is a colonial project for, I don't know, for 400 years, how long? Something like that.
Well, 250, let's say.
Yeah, but like, okay, they're 10 million. They're 10 million. At that instance, 10 million. It's insane numbers. Like,
yeah, and they knew. It's not like it's coming to light now again because history has been rewritten. But while it was happening, the British knew and didn't care. Like they absolutely knew what was happening and didn't care, and they were fine with it. Just like the Irish famine in 1846, 1844. The big Irish famine that depopulated Ireland, that Ireland is still just catching up in terms of population. So the Gaza March of Return. So the March of Return was this nonviolent agitation, which culminated in just the Israelis slaughtering everybody in front of all of the cameras. And the theory that it was because of cameras, or the theory that it was because of attention, or the theory that by presenting the information or by presenting the images to the media or to the public, that would somehow automatically stop the genocide or stop the violence, that the state had to deal with that. I just think that was the moment. 2018 was the moment. And if 2018 didn't convince you, this past 2 years should have convinced you that publicity or information in itself isn't going to do that job. It's too much of a burden to put on the information space to stop a genocidal state or imperialist system of states from committing atrocities. That again requires armed struggle, and the people in the region are doing it against all odds. But I think the last argument for if you want a scientific proof, that was what I wrote in that Substack you're referencing, is I think 2018 Palestine was the most scientific study you could have, a controlled experiment to prove forever, hopefully, that nonviolence doesn't work and is a very deadly thing to try and should not be attempted.
I read that Israel wants to be hated by the world, because without that hate, they can't argue that they're always under threat, and then they can't argue that they need all this apartheid and occupation and military laws, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think that's an I hear that a lot. So it's like the idea that what the oppression that they're committing against the Palestinians or anywhere else is based on fear. And I think that is also ultimately incorrect. I think that there's a crime you commit, like, if you think of animals, an animal instinct is to lash out when you're afraid. So certain animals, whether it's a rabbit, you're going to run away when you're afraid. If you're a deer, you're going to run away when you're afraid. If you're a dog and you're afraid, you're going to bite. Dogs have this kind of courage when they don't care that you're bigger than them. They're going to bite you. If they're scared, they're going to bite you. If you come near them, they're going to bite you, right? So it's usually these carnivorous animals. But humans and human societies, you have to be very careful with these animal analogies. And so the Israelis are not doing I do not believe the Israelis are doing what they're doing because they're afraid. I don't believe that the white people in the American South who were against Black children going to schools with their white children or swimming in pools with their white children. I don't think they were afraid. They might say they were afraid. Like police, every time police shoot a Black person in America, they always go on the stand and they say, I feared for my life. They all say it. Yeah. They say, I feared for my life. If anyone in America is saying I'm afraid for my life, the next thing that's very likely to happen is they're going to shoot you. Mm-hmm. So be very afraid when an American with a gun tells you I'm afraid for my life. They're setting up their future defense for shooting you, but they're not actually afraid. They're not afraid whatsoever for their lives. These are crimes of power. These are crimes of impunity. They are doing these things because they're not afraid. They're not afraid of any consequences. They're not afraid that the bombs will stop flowing. They're not afraid the fuel will stop flowing or the food will stop flowing. They're not afraid of the ICC or the ICJ. They're not afraid of any of these things. If they were afraid of these things, they would actually not be committing these crimes.
Yeah, I think you're right, but I'm just
I think we should address these kinds of things that we hear. I think we should, go through them one at a time. And
they need this excuse to say that they fear for their lives, and to fear for their lives, they need to be hated, and to be hated, they need to do heinous things.
I mean, there could be a different way of looking at it, and not maybe as, they're afraid, but so it's a patchwork of people that don't actually have a shared history. They come from different parts of the world. So the idea that they would need a constant enemy to rally around, I think there's some logic in that. I don't know. I don't think that. So that may be part of it, but I mean, in the root of things, I think it's still the supremacism and the fact that it's a colonial project.
That's politics, right? I mean, having an enemy to rally around is politics. Like American politics is that. American, the Republicans do things to own the liberals. Everything they do is like, the Democrats did this wrong, and now we're gonna do that. But that, what's going on in Palestine goes way beyond that. It goes way beyond rallying behind a flag or against a common enemy. It's a project of colonialism, and it's a project of taking people's land and confining them and imprisoning them and torturing them and stealing their identities. It goes way beyond rallying around a flag. So the concept that like they need to be hated, I see it as the opposite. I think they experience such unconditional love and support that's why they're committing these crimes. I think it's like
super spoiled child.
Yeah, it's very strange to be protected from the consequences of these crimes the way that they are. Like the International Caucasian Court, as they call it, right? They've indicted all of these African leaders, and this is the other than Russia. I mean, Russia as a whole, we don't need to talk about Russia. It's too complicated.
We can. It's fine. We at this space we can't talk about Russia.
We
it's all
can.
right.
But like other than Russia, it's all Africans that have been indicted, and they indicted Putin and one other person in Russia, knowing that they can't enforce it. They know that that's not going to happen. And Israel is, they indicted these three people at the same time as they indicted the Palestinian leaders, all of whom Israel killed. So, it is not hate. These are not crimes of like people who are hated and have decided, well, you hate me anyway. Even their reactions are the opposite of that. When people actually dislike them, when they go to Amsterdam and they rip down Palestinian flags and assault people, and then some subset of them fight back, they're totally shocked. They're just like, how could you do this to us? Don't you know who we are? So
exactly.
It's not they hate us anyway. That's not their reaction. Their reaction is much more surprise and shock that, people get upset when you murder babies or, assault them in the street.
Isn't there some sort of parallel to that? Like their response to Al-Aqsa flood or 7th of October was this insane amount of violence, because they were like, how can you try to break free? Like, don't you know that you shouldn't? Like, you're not allowed to. Fredrik, can you mute? Could you mute?
Oh, sorry.
Isn't there like a parallel to?
Well, yeah, like in acting, right? If you go to an acting class, they'll take a sentence and they'll say, which word you emphasize changes the meaning. So it's like, Israelis said after October 7th, how could you do this to us? And most of the world heard, how could you do this to us? And so people are like, oh, this is like the stuff that they made up. It's false stuff. Beheaded babies, oh, was a lie. Mass rapes was a lie. But like, it's this. But in fact, what Israelis were saying was, how could you do this to us? The emphasis was always on the us, because we, nothing should ever happen to us. And that's racism, right? It's not, and so for them, this doesn't matter. Us matters. And you can even make up and change what this is. And if one this doesn't stick, you can have another this. You can just make, and they did, right? They made up different things over time. And they found people to tell these stories that changed over time.
To build consent for genocide.
Yeah. And when something doesn't, they have focus groups. When something doesn't work, they try something else, because the details don't matter. The facts don't matter. What matters is that it happened to us, and us, maintaining us. That's what it's about.
Yeah. We're the ones doing this stuff to you, not the other way around.
Yeah, exactly.
All the while, there is nothing that can be compared to what happened on 7th of October to whatever Israel has done. I mean, all of that was a lie. That was basically a prison break, a military operation with specific goals. None of that had anything
special military operation.
Oh, no, that's...
yeah. It had nothing to do with targeting civilians, for example. We went through this with our lecture with you before, but it's just it's like it doesn't compute.
Because it's not that it doesn't compute. It's that, like, when you're telling somebody something and they don't understand it, and you've explained it 5 different ways and the evidence is clear, they're not understanding it because they're not interested in it. They're not here to debate the facts with you. John Elmer had this. He tells this story. I hate to tell his story, but I always throw this joke in his face, because he was an editor at a newspaper, and there was some story that got in about Palestine, and this was decades ago, and someone called him and said, this story is anti-Israel, whatever. And John, being John, he says, but the facts, these are everything that we wrote here, everything that we published is the facts. And the person said, John, it's not about the facts. And for John, that was like the most offensive thing for John Elmer, right? Like, it's not about but that was, that's so profound that, like, an Israel lobbyist says that to explain, like, it is not about the facts. It's not about the facts for them.
Alarms are going everywhere right now. You said the Israel lobby, so maybe actually we should actually exactly. There's this constant debate. Maybe we can tackle that as well quickly. So now we've talked about nonviolence. I think we can talk about other things.
So is it the debate is wrong. The premises of the debate are wrong, and that's why people get bogged down. Like,
you got my point, but you're so quick. But if people didn't understand what I'm talking about,
okay.
there's this question constantly coming up. Oh, is it the dog that's wagging the tail, or is it the tail that wags the dog? So is it the Israeli lobby that is controlling the US, or is it the US that's controlling Israel? There have been an insane witch hunt against a left parliamentarian in Sweden just last week, who shared a picture that Mohammed Hadid, Bella Hadid and the Hadids, he shared a picture with the Israeli flag hand controlling the US, whatever. And then Bisan, the Palestinian journalist in Gaza, said, well, isn't it actually it's actually the other way around. And then this left parliamentarian shared Bisan's post. But then people are like, oh, you're an anti-Semite, you're sharing anti-Semitism, whatever. It's like, it's insane. It doesn't make sense, but whatever.
So let's just, maybe we can settle on this podcast. Maybe we can settle this once and for all.
Yes,
because
thank you.
I have I think the premises of this are incorrect. So why, like, I do not believe that America and Israel are separate entities. There's an incorrect notion that we live in this world of sovereign states, and these certain states exercise more power over others. And I believe that we live in a world of basically an empire, an Anglo-American empire, all of the elites of which are Zionist and pro-Israel. And they, the headquarters is diffuse. The elites have slightly different, they have debates on who to go to war with first. They have debates on tactics. They have debates on who should be in charge, who should be benefiting the most at any given time. And they take turns. Different factions take turns. And so I don't think that it's one country determining what happens in another country. It's these factions of elites gathering resources for different projects. So, like, Israel wants to go to war with Iran, or whatever. This faction in Israel wants to go to war with Iran. And there are lots of people in America that want to go to war with Iran. And there are others. There's another faction that says, no, we should go to war with Russia first. We need more shells to send to Ukraine instead. And so we have to make some trades. But for the most part, they agree that shells for Israel are more important than shells for Ukraine. So there's certain areas of consensus among this elite, and Israel and genocide is one of the main ones. And so whenever there's a dispute, like Canada and America are supposedly having a dispute, and it's about tariffs, but the same Canadian elites, the Canadian politicians who are like, we will fight the Americans and we will not back down in the face of American pressure, are all pro-genocide. They're all completely pro-genocide and pro-Israel. And so, I've made this joke many times, is like, why don't these American and Canadian politicians sit down and remember how much they have in common, like genocide, and then once they talk, they can get those warm feelings of pro-genocide and realize how much common ground they have. And then small matters like tariffs can be resolved. And so if you understand the ruling class and the ruling elite to be somewhat transnational in character, across the Atlantic.
They love to travel, God knows.
Yeah, reaching into going to Davos, going to, right? And they go these places and they have these resorts and they all go and to these retreats and they go to that island where
private
Epstein
jets,
owned.
Of course they would.
Yeah, they take their private jets to Epstein's island and they commit sexual assault against, they're united by all of these things that they do across countries. And so it's just a diversion to say, like, who's pulling the strings. Like, there are, if Trump is the president, he's pulling strings and Biden is not. When Biden was president, he was pulling strings. Netanyahu can go to the White House anytime, and no matter who's in power, they're going to hold out his chair and they're going to, tell him whatever he wants to hear. And then if he goes before Congress, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, they're all going to applaud. So it's just a waste of energy to say who's in charge of what, because it's not that there isn't an America and Israel as distinct entities. The whole thing is a project that they're all embarked on together.
It's a Israel.
Israel. Yeah, exactly. I read that some Russian commentator used to call it the Anglo-Zionist Empire. It's a little too edgy, I think, now, but it might come into fashion at some point.
Talking about imperialism, you had this article as well, a tanky primer, which I keep sending people. I mean, this idea that there are imperialisms keeps popping up as well constantly, and it's just so tiring. But since we have you here, and since people now should have a grasp that you have you dove deep into history, and you know a bit about imperialism. So can you please tell our audience that there are no imperialisms right now?
Yeah, so here's what I think happened. I think, Hobson and Lenin, they both wrote books around the same time called Imperialism. So Lenin read Hobson's book and he was like, oh my God, this is a bourgeois historian, but he gets so much right. And what they were talking about was the causes of World War I. And they were explaining that World War I happened because several different countries embarked on a colonial project where they were trying to divide up the world, and captive markets and captive sources of natural resources, and draining the resources from these different countries. And, Britain was the original and no one can come close, but France was getting in there and Germany was getting in there. And even Russia, Tsarist Russia, had some territorial ambitions with its neighbors. And America was getting, wanting to have, control over the hemisphere, and then maybe branching out into certain islands, the Philippines. So Lenin and Hobson looked at that and they said, Lenin specifically looked at that and he said, look, these blocks of power are finding a lot of profit and a lot of power in taking little chunks of the world and turning them into captive colonial territories to be drained. And this gives so many advantages and so much power that they're not going to want to stop. And so now that by 1918 or whatever, 1914, I guess, the whole world had already been, there's no part of the world that's not taken. It's not in somebody's sphere of influence. And Lenin said, look, the only way now to determine who should get, if you want to readjust, if you're Germany and you think you should have more, the only way to readjust is based on strength. And the only way to test strength is war. And therefore there's going to be war. And that's why this world war happened. So that was like his analysis of how imperialism leads to war. The problem with applying that now is that World War I, between World War I and World War II, was a very specific historical moment. So there are certain theoretical insights, but the historical moment was one where the British were actually the big imperialists. The Americans were coming online, but it was like America and Britain. A lot of the imperialist theorists at the time, like Cecil Rhodes and Milner and people like that, said we should do this together. And should we do it under British leadership or American leadership? They didn't really think of it that way. There's a guy who wrote a book called The Atlantic Ruling Class or something like that. So this was theorized and written about and understood that America and Britain were going to do these things together. And then France was subordinate to that, and everybody else was going to have to be subordinate to that. But what do we do with Germany, Russia, Japan? This was this moment in history. And what they decided to do with Germany, Russia, and Japan was to bring Germany into the thing, to keep them from starting an independent bloc, to keep Germany and Russia from having an alliance, to contain, ultimately at the end of World War II, to contain Russia and maybe hopefully break it up, and then to occupy militarily Japan and occupy, I guess Germany's militarily occupied too. So the idea that Germany or Japan were going to try to become rivals is gone now. And it has not been replaced with China or Iran or Russia. So from the point of view of the way the global economy works, from the point of view of the way the resources of the world flow from the global south to the global north, from the point of view of like who is draining what, there is only one empire. So like imperialism is today this Western American led project, and the beneficiaries of it are Canada and all the Western countries, Sweden and Norway and Germany. The free world, the one map, right? The one map. There's always like one map. Who votes for Israel at the United Nations? Who votes against climate change? Who votes against healthcare as a human right? Who votes against food as a human right? It's always the same. Those countries are the beneficiaries of imperialism, and then you take China or Iran or Russia, and these are countries that are trying to have sovereignty. So it's not a world of sovereign countries, and there are countries that are trying to have sovereignty, and there are countries that whose elites are just fully subordinated to the West. And so what we're talking about is not a clash between rival imperialisms. What we're talking about is a clash between imperialism and would-be sovereign countries. And China has pretty much achieved sovereignty. Russia is at war with the West, and the West keeps, again, like, don't look at it in terms of years, look at it in terms of decades. And the West keeps moving closer to Russia's borders and creating wars inside Russia and trying to have Russia's neighbors fighting with Russia. And Iran is the same. Iran is in the same position as Russia. Iran is trying to have sovereignty, and the Americans are moving ever closer and periodically bombing them and sanctioning them and trying to destroy their state. And if you have, there are smaller countries that are making the attempt as well, and they're having an even harder time. Cuba, Venezuela, a handful of these countries that are trying to achieve, where the elites are trying to achieve sovereignty, and they suffer a lot. And the whole point of the empire and what the Americans and British and others try to do is make the population suffer, so that other countries don't think to do it and don't try to develop their own resources. So that's why I don't believe that there are imperialisms, and that's why I think you even with leftist theorists, you have to, I believe my approach is, you have to look at when they were writing, you have to look at what data they were looking at, and you have to look at whether the situation is still the same enough that analogy applies, or whether you have to change the analogy somewhat. So
I'm pretty sure that when people hear you talk about China, for example, they have a lot of ideas about how China is also an empire, or how they also act imperialistically, whatever, especially with regards to Africa. I'd like to, I mean, you can of course respond to that as well, but I just want to remind people, just look at most people probably listening to us have a sense of understanding how terrible the media is with regards to Gaza. Mm-hmm. I just want them to apply that framework to the reporting on China, the reporting on Russia, the reporting on Venezuela, whatever the empire has its sights on. That's sort of the, I don't know, black box they get from the media.
Yeah, and they hate Muslims, but they love them in China and Russia or wherever, right? Like they hate these groups. They hate Africans, right? Like all of these people who are like so concerned about China in Africa are totally against Africans coming to Europe or coming to North America. They, you know, the hateful things they say about Africans are never far from their lips, you know? And there's, I don't know if you saw this, but there was some German minister, and he went to, I think, Namibia. And it's this conversation. The Namibian, I think it was the Namibian president, and he's a big man.
Yeah.
And the German guy's this little guy, relatively. I don't know. The German guy might be little too, but I mean, might be big too. But the Namibian president's this big guy, and he's very confident. And he's just like, the German guy's like, you know, China. And the Namibian president is just like, you know, he just starts telling stories. He's like, we had a delegation, you know, go to Germany, and they were all stopped, and they were all searched, and they were all harassed. It's like, this was a diplomatic delegation. He's like, that never happens when we go to China. That never happens.
They roll out the red carpet to us, and
yeah, he just kind of went on and on. He just talked about all of the. He was like, this is not a China, you know, problem. This is not a China problem. You know, you guys. It was very good. I can't watch that enough. I share it with a lot of people. Have you seen it?
Yeah, I've seen it. I remember. Yeah, it was a great moment, absolutely. And I mean, for people who don't know, Germany did actually a genocide in Namibia.
Yeah, so, exactly.
I'm pretty sure a lot of people do not know. So
I didn't know. If you go on my the historical archives of my podcast, we did a 29-part series on the scramble for Africa, and just, you know, if you have the stomach to listen to that, and you then like look at what China is doing in terms of building roads or making deals for gold or diamonds or whatever other resources, and building a school, and you have the ability to think that that's the same thing, you're lost, man. Like, it's
I mean, there's like just quickly to tell people that this idea that China is debt trapping Africa is just a complete lie. Like there's a recent research that actually scientifically tells you that has never happened. So there's no proof.
Yeah, like they've rescheduled whenever a country can't pay the debt, China just reschedules the debt. I wrote about this too in 2022 for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. I wrote an article called "Why Comparing Chinese Africa Investment to Western Colonialism is No Joke." So I was taking issue with a Trevor Noah episode on China and Africa. And there's a lecture from a couple of years before that, and it was like a trade minister for one of the African countries, and he was giving a talk, I think at Harvard or Chicago Kennedy School or somewhere like that, and he was very, again, like a really cool guy, very patient. And have you seen this one?
And no, that one I've missed that one.
He just answers all of their questions, and he gives these numbers of how many times China like reschedules debts, and, you know, doesn't take over industries or privatize them, and
they've done multiple debt for
minister. His name is Gyude Moore, Gyude, and then Moore, Moore. He's the ex-minister for public works for Liberia. And he said there were 87 cases of restructuring or rescheduling of loans between 2000 and 2019.
I mean, compared to what IMF or World Bank would do.
That's right. That's the relevant comparison.
Exactly. I mean, it's because they've destroyed countries for this stuff. So, and that was the purpose, giving them loans. So. Anyways, let's move that aside. So you've done. Do you know how many episodes you've done on Gaza sit-reps? Do you have a number?
Maybe 170 some now.
So you have some idea of what has happened, what have been happening.
Yeah.
Is it a genocide, really?
Okay. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
What have you learned?
Okay, so where I think I guess I'll just say a couple of things that characterize my approach to this. One is I don't believe that this is a Netanyahu project. I don't believe this is about Netanyahu avoiding prosecution. I don't believe this is about Netanyahu avoiding jail. I believe that if this wasn't Netanyahu, it would be someone else. I don't especially believe that Ben Gvir or Smotrich are worse. I don't believe it's worse. I don't believe in worse or better. I don't believe in Trump or Biden being worse. I believe that, again, this is a big project of a unified elite across several countries that all have a consensus that the industrial base of the United States, such as it is, needs to primarily produce bombs, and those bombs need to primarily be dropped on children in Gaza. And that's the pipeline that is happening. And the only things that are imposing costs, if you want to analyze it in terms of costs, right now are the Yemen, Ansar Allah, and their blockade and their ability to fight off the Americans who are continuously trying to destroy their state as punishment and as an example. And the fact that the military resistance in Gaza still exists, and the fact that the military resistance in Lebanon still exists, whether those forces are looking for a ceasefire, but their existence and the inability of Israel and America to defeat them is what remains in terms of the potential to stop this genocide, or the potential to liberate Palestine right now. So that there's a thing that many of the resistance leaders would say. Well, now some of them are still alive, not all of them are. They would always say, watch the battlefield. And so that was one of the main things that I try to do in the sit reps, and that's one of the main things of my approach. And there are theorists, political theorists have said this for decades, and guerrilla theorists have said this, which is the highest form, the most advanced form of struggle is military struggle. And so there's political and social base for this, but the top of the pyramid is the military struggle. And so it's not an adjunct to what else is going on. It is the main thing that is going on, and everything else feeds into that. And there's also no way to impose. Israel can't impose what it wants without winning this military struggle. And the military struggle is not won for Israel, it's ongoing. And so these are some of the main points that I try to get across. And the reason I keep coming back and making these videos is because part of psychological warfare is to draw people's attention to the plans, to draw people's attention to false divisions within Israeli politics, to draw people's attention to the fantasies that they have of their superiority, or what they're going to do with Gaza, or how they're going to settle it, or whatever it is. And I the way to the reason all of those are deceptions, and the reason all of those are part of the psychological warfare, is to try to get you not to watch the battlefield, right? And there's a lot to be done in the West. There's Palestine Action, I think, is the most advanced, and that is fundamentally nonviolent too, although they're treated as terrorists and imprisoned and punished. So it doesn't, but it is really advanced, the most advanced and the most important thing going on in the West, I think. And there are other activities like education and financial support that I also I'm very much in favor of. But I also, in terms of information, in terms of what people should know, I think people need to know the military situation, and I think it's a very neglected part of the story. So I guess that's my approach.
What is the military situation right now?
Well, it's actually interesting because the ceasefire. So this is a good way for me to outline my approach, because people say the ceasefire came because of Trump, and I said the ceasefire came because the Israeli army was exhausted. And so Trump came and said, I'm making you do this, and then immediately said, how about we ethnically cleanse Gaza? And they went, and violated their entire deal and stopped letting aid in and started to bomb. And they were bombing for a long time, and they killed a lot of people and have bombed hospitals and tents and all of the rest of the things that they do. But now they're going back in on the ground. And now that they've started going back in on the ground, they've started losing on the ground, because when Israel fights on the ground, Israel loses on the ground. That is almost an iron law of this military conflict so far. So they've had they've had tanks hit by the Yasin 105s. They've had ambushes in houses, and these are all going to continue. And so this is the military part of the story that people need to understand, is that Israel cannot seem to win on the ground. So everything that they're doing is to try. It's an experiment that's unfolding in terms of, can you commit genocide? Can you genocide your way? Can you aerially genocide your way to your military objectives?
I was going to actually ask, why do they need to go in?
Because
there are the hostages, right? But they don't care about the hostages.
No, that's not why they would go in. The hostages are as likely to die from ground operations as air operations. So it's not. They're not. You have to go in because military conflict is actually about controlling people and controlling land, and you cannot do that from the air. You can destroy from the air, but even destroying from the air is very costly. It's the costs of what they're doing could only be borne by the entire West. If this is another reason you have to understand, this is not I don't think that Israel is a forward base of America, and I don't think that America is a rear base for Israel. I think those are both, again, if you understand it as an integrated system, that question is not really there. But I do think America is as much of a rear base for Israel as the opposite. So the cost of destroying things from the air is enormous. If they could win on the ground, if they could send in an army and defeat the Palestinian resistance, they would have been able to reoccupy, resettle. They would have been into their settlement project. They would have been a year and a half into their settlement project by now. That was what their fantasy tells them. Their racial superiority ought to have, been able to defeat these people, but they can't. So so do they have to go in? This is now their question. Their question is, can we starve them enough or bomb them enough to not have to go in, to win a victory without, like in history, it hasn't happened. No army has ever won, even however imperialist, has ever won through air power and siege alone. But maybe this is going to be the first time. So, you know, and I think we don't know. I don't know. I know that they seem to have to go in, even after all of this. They seem to have to go in, and the fact that they lose every time they go in, and this is a, you know, there's a crisis in terms of their army and troops, and people think American troops are going to go and solve the problem for them, but America has as much problem with troops, and American troops are not magic, right? This is all the same equipment, it's the same training. These are, many of them are probably American already.
Yeah,
and probably are Western mercenaries galore fighting for Israel.
They probably know less about the situation as well. Like they're
So this is one of the things that I was say about like the Russia-Ukraine war. You know, like people they're always talking about how the British and the Americans are training the Ukrainians, but it's like Ukrainians should be training the British and Americans. You know, in terms of like who's actually been fighting, who has experience fighting. Like, why are British who haven't done anything? What are they training? How could they train Ukrainians? What could they tell Ukrainians that Ukrainians don't know? They're going to tell them how Russians fight. They're going to, you know, anyway.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I've always thought that was bizarre, Western training. But
I mean, I think that worked for training Palestinian Authority because it's like a collaborative or
yeah, I don't know that they need training. They need salary. They're paying their salaries. Like it's the fact that they're paying their salaries.
Yeah, but I mean, don't you think like the way they sort of control population, like the way they bust protests and torture people, like isn't that like the imperial sort of playbook?
Yeah, I don't, you know, that's not a trivial question. Is that like a form of expertise? I think maybe it's a form of expertise. But you know, if you talk about the West Bank and why the West Bank, you know, why the struggle in the West Bank has the form that it does is because, like you said, of these American trained Palestinian Authority army that's basically suppressing the population. But it's also a decision by the resistance that they don't want to have that civil war.
Yeah, they don't want to have Palestinian blood.
The patience that the resistance is showing is infinite. And, you know, I don't know where that's going to go. I imagine when it gets too hot for the Palestinian Authority, the Israelis do invade. And then the situation with weapons is actually more difficult in the West Bank. But there are lots of things that can happen in the West Bank that are unpredictable now. So, yeah. And I don't want to venture any predictions about that.
Thank you. We have like 5 minutes with you left.
Sure.
It's been fantastic. Thank you. I mean, I was expecting something fantastic, and it's been fantastic.
Shucks.
But do you have any more questions, Frederick? Otherwise,
I have enough for my little brain to process. This has been an amazing history lesson for me.
Go ahead.
No.
Sorry.
Oh, maybe for a later session.
Yeah, but like a closer question, maybe.
Hope. What gives you hope?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great closer. I think that long term, I don't think this project of continuous war and genocide with all of their neighbors is viable. I don't think all of them are going to surrender the way that they've surrendered. I think that all of these surrenders, like Egypt, we haven't gotten into that, but like Egypt and Jordan, you know,
Turkey,
I think that all of these are, you know, they were not surrendered and now they're surrendered, and that means that they could also not be surrendered again. So I just think that you know, if Gaza is ethnically cleansed and Israel occupies Sinai and takes Sinai back from Egypt and has some kind of control over the population and tries to settle Gaza with Jewish settlers, that's not the end. That's just, the war just goes on. It just goes on from Sinai. And if they ethnically cleanse all of the West Bank to Jordan, the war will just go on. If they destroy the temple in they destroy the mosque in Al-Aqsa and build their temple and slaughter animals all day, the war goes on. So there's not a exit. If you analyze it from the other side, they're talking about extermination and ethnic cleansing, but there's that doesn't win the war for them. That doesn't end the war for them.
They don't have an off switch either. Like,
yeah. So it's just like, for me, you know, when you see the courage of Ansar Allah and the people in Yemen and like the way that they've responded, where, you know, they're being bombed, they're bombing, they're gathered, and 1 million people are gathered and they're bombing nearby, and they just chant like, "We don't care." Like, how can you not have hope? Like, that's
it has almost become a tradition that I end with asking, do you agree with Ilan Pape that we're seeing the beginning of the end of the Zionist project?
Yeah, I exactly, because when you look, like, how do they reverse this? Do people just start thinking that it's okay and safe, like that, you know, or that these people that posed in women's underwear that they killed and played with children's toys that they killed, like,
I mean,
is this,
if we go, but I mean, if you, so this, sorry, but to just to maybe a little pushback or to
that's okay.
Like, we talked about how, like, what happened in India for hundreds of years. I mean, tens of millions, up to 100 million people were killed by the Brits, right?
Yeah.
And people did forget about it. I mean, not Indians didn't, obviously, but even though there are books, but I mean, the 99% of the Western population is still calling Churchill the hero or whatever. You know? Yeah,
but that's not the metric. The metric is that the British are gone from India, right? Like,
true.
So, you know, if 100 years from now, you know, Palestine is free, and people say Netanyahu was a good guy, who cares?
Yeah, no, I'm fine. I'm fine by that. I mean, I will never talk to those people, but I'm fine with that.
Yeah, like, again, it's a material, like the material reality is the issue, and rewriting history is bad, and it's deadly, and it has material consequences. But, like, you know, I think it's the material situation that's unsolvable now for them. And yeah, so that's why, like Professor Pape says, like, there's no way to get back to normal.
Yeah.
And if a critical mass of Israelis want normal lives, which I think they do, because, you know, you can be indoctrinated to hate your neighbors, but, like, what are you willing to sacrifice for that hate? How much are you willing to sacrifice? Lots of people are willing to sacrifice a lot. But if a critical mass wants a normal life, that makes Israel unviable.
Yeah. Inshallah. Let's say that. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Is there anything you'd like to finish with?
No, it's been great. It's always great to talk to you, and it was great to meet you, Frederick.
You too.
Thank you so much.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter, yeah.
Hope to talk to you another time.
Sure.
It's been great.
This is fun. This morning I had, like, small chickens as guests in my morning show, and then later in the day I get to have this. I love my life.
Yeah, that's a good morning to me.
Yeah, me too. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.
Peace.
Ja. Vad tyckte du?
Shall I go?
Yeah, you're free to go. Class dismissed.
If you don't want me to kick you out, then
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Ja, nej, men jätte intressant såklart. Man blir ju liksom bara en liten pojke i skolbänken och jag gillar det.
Yeah.
Alltså det är såna här historielektioner man hade velat ha i skolan liksom. Allt det här minns jag ingenting av att de sa i Blommensbergsskolan på historielektionerna liksom. Det var bara
Alltså,
andra världskriget, feudalismen.
Ja, helt sant. Det som jag är så fascinerad över just hans sätt är att han gör det så accessible. Alltså man kan ju ha någon historiker prata om det här och det skulle vara jättetråkigt och liksom jättemycket saker som man inte ens förstår och så vidare. Men jag tycker hans sätt att förklara saker och ting är väldigt simpelt, även om ämnen är väldigt djupa och han har en enorm kunskap. Men han gör det så lätt för den som lyssnar. Han är ju akademiker också, så det finns någon pedagogi.
Verkligen. Jag utan ett enda HP fattar ändå vad han säger.
Men alltså, du är ju insatt ändå. Men jag tänker liksom allmänt, han pratar om väldigt tunga, svåra, komplexa ämnen. Men gör det på ett väldigt simpelt sätt. Och det uppskattar jag väldigt mycket faktiskt.
Bra bokning, bra jobbat.
Tack. Som sagt, jag tycker att vi kan bjuda honom in igen någon annan gång. För det känns som att vi kommer behöva prata om likadana saker.
Men man älskar ju folk som har liksom the greater picture.
Ja,
det är
precis.
det. Som inte bara kan specifikt något smalt, utan bara så här. Man öppnar Pandoras ask till liksom hela hemligheten på något vis.
Precis. Och samtidigt har han också väldigt djup kunskap också.
Verkligen.
I de ämnen som han pratar om.
Det är inte att han kan lite om allt, utan han kan mycket om allt.
Ja, precis. Ja, det är väldigt fascinerande faktiskt. Men det var jättekul för min del och fint att få prata med honom igen. Tack så mycket. Tack för att jag fick göra det. Det var jättebra. Så vad har vi härnäst?
Ja, jag vet faktiskt inte. Men vi har massa roliga namn i chatten som flyger runt.
Ja, precis. Det kommer bli kul.
Förhoppningsvis kan Kajsa vara med också.
Ja, precis. Det vore jättebra.
Du får bara inte föreslå en tid efter klockan 16. Då blir hon rasande.
Nej, precis. Men folk får gärna subscribe, dela, tipsa.
Verkligen. Jag såg att Nej till NATO hade lagt ut någonting från förra avsnittet, något klipp. Det betyder ju jättemycket. Vi har ju liksom ingen stor spelare i ryggen här som hjälper oss att få ut det här. Så att alla delningar, även om du har 125 följare på Instagram, om du delar ett klipp som någon ser som har 500 följare, som delar till någon som har 1000 följare, till någon som har 10 000 följare. Alltså det är verkligen så det funkar.
Ja, precis. So do it.
Please.
Yes.
Men non-violent shares.
Ja. Ta hand om dig.
Ha det bäst. Ciao.
Hej.
Nu vill jag bubbel.